Good morning, dear students. I hope you all are fine at your home. But today we are going to start our chapter Mother's Day. The writer is J.B. Priestley. Mother's Day is about the condition of mothers, that how mothers are treated at home. And let us see what is the twist there in the play Mother's Day. So I am going to start the summary of this chapter. Please listen carefully. So, as I have told you, the title of the chapter is Mother's Day, and the writer is J.B. Priestley. So, in this chapter, J.B. Priestley portraying the status of a mother in a household. Priestley humorously explores the story of Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Pearson, who was in her 40s, it means about her age, that she was about 40 years. She stands up for her right and how her family reacts at this. Means to say, when Mrs. Pearson finds that she was not given the rights in her family, so she stands up for her rights. She did something for her rights. And let us see what happened then. Mrs. Pearson is very fond of her family and works day and night to support her family members in the best possible manner. It means to say that, like a common mother, Mrs. Pearson also was taking care of her family in a very well manner. Her family was loving for her. However, she is upset at the way she is being treated. But when she saw that how she was treated by her family members, she was upset. Nobody cares for her or asks about her. All day long she stays at home doing all the work, means to say all the work of home. In the evening, when the kids and her husband return, she kept herself busy in meeting their demands. Means to say, when their son, their daughter, their husband came in home, so they demanded something, and she was busy in fulfilling their demands. But she was not finding time for thinking herself. She did not want any dislikable thing to happen in the household because she loves her family very much. Yet she longed for their attention and a little respect. But on the other hand, she also wanted that her family should respect her. So, Mrs. Fitzgerald, another character here, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who was her neighbor, a fortune teller. Fortune teller means she was a she was able to tell about future. So she came to meet Mrs. Pearson. She is older and a heavy woman. She told Mrs. Pearson that she could help her. When Mrs. Fitzgerald saw all the things which Mrs. Pearson was facing, so Mrs. Fitzgerald offered help. She proposed that they could exchange their bodies, and then, with Pearson's body, she would teach a lesson to Pearson's family that Mrs. Pearson was not able to teach her family because she was too humble and nice to do that. Now, what is the meaning of this? It means that Mrs. Fitzgerald knows about a magic, and through that magic, what she could do, she was able to exchange the souls. So she convinced Mrs. Pearson, and they both sat in front of each other, and Mrs. Fitzgerald chanted her magical spell, and they both were able to exchange their souls. So now, what will happen in Mrs. Pearson's body? Mrs. Fitzgerald will be there, and in Mrs. Fitzgerald's body, Pearson will be there. So what will happen next? In Pearson's family, the body will be of Pearson, but in actual Mrs. Fitzgerald, who will teach the lesson to Pearson's family. So let us see. Though reluctant, Mrs. Pearson agreed to the idea and to exchange their bodies. Mrs. Pearson was still not sure and asked Mrs. Fitzgerald if she could get her body back. However, determined, Fitzgerald tells Pearson to not worry and that she would handle the matter carefully. She left Pearson's home with Mrs. Pearson's body, as I have told you. So, Mrs. Fitzgerald left the home with Pearson's body. She knew what she was to do to teach Pearsons a lesson so they would not bother Mrs. Pearson in future unnecessarily. So now at Pearson's home, Mrs. Fitzgerald was there, in whose body, sorry, Pearson was there, and in whose body Mrs. Fitzgerald was there. So Mrs. Pearson, who was actually with Mrs. Fitzgerald's soul, smoked a cigarette first of all. But in actually, Pearson was not smoking cigarette anyway, and was confident than ever. A few moments later, her daughter Doris Pearson entered the house and started demanding tea and her dress. Mrs. Pearson was sure to make her realize that she was Doris' mother and not a servant. In actually, when Doris came, so Pearson was helping her daughter, but today we know that Pearson is there, but in her body, Mrs. Fitzgerald's soul was working. So Doris was stunned, surprised to see her mother smoking, and that she had not prepared tea for her, and that her dress was not ready as well. So Doris told her mother that she was to go out with Charlie Spence, who is Doris' friend, on which the mother remarked if she could not find someone better than Charlie Spence. This broke Doris, and she left weeping. Then came son Cyril Pearson. So Cyril, who is amused at his mother's strange behavior, they get into an argument. When Cyril came, so she was in argument with her mother. The children could not understand the situation. When the mother left to fetch the malt means beer, the children discussed their mother's behavior because Mrs. Pearson was not drinking beer or anything else. But today she was drinking. But you know the reason. In Mrs. Pearson's body, Mrs. Fitzgerald was there. That's why she was smoking a cigarette or drinking beer. Doris felt that it might have been that mother got her head hit. So Doris was thinking that might be possible her mother got injury in her head. That's why she was behaving like that. Then enters mother with a bottle of stout and a glass half filled with it. Stout means again beer or drink, we say, whiskey type. The children began to laugh and the mother chided them, means scolded them and asked them to behave like grown-ups. Doris then asked her mother for her such behavior. Then Mrs. Pearson tells them that it is actually the children's and her husband's behavior that has disturbed her. When the children asked Mrs. Pearson that why she was behaving like that, then Mrs. Pearson replied that it is my children or my husband's behavior that changed me. Because you didn't respect me, you don't respect me, I always do everything for you, but you don't care for me. They always come and go without bothering about her. They demand duties for her, and she does her best to keep everyone happy, and still nobody is bothered about her. She remarks that while the three of them do a job of 40 hours a week and 2 days at the weekend, and what I am getting, I also need weekend. She goes on working 7 days round the clock. She says that I don't have any rest, so why you? She proclaimed, means announced very clearly, that she would do some work on Saturday and Sunday only if she is thanked for everything. So Mrs. Pearson, in whose body actually Mrs. Fitzgerald was speaking, that if you will be thankful to me, only then I will do work on Saturday and Sunday. When the mother scolded Doris and Cyril properly, scolded means chided, George Pearson entered, Mrs. Pearson's husband, George Pearson entered, and is annoyed at her wife's sipping stout, and he was also surprised to see that Mrs. Pearson was sipping beer. He told her that he would have supper at the club and that he did not want tea. So George told that today I will not take tea. The wife told him that there was no tea at all. He got annoyed, and the wife then said that when he did not want tea, then why he was fighting for it. Mrs. Pearson is flabbergasted, means to say annoyed at such conduct of his wife, because Mr. Pearson was also not used to of such kind of behavior from her wife. The wife continues to rebuke the husband, telling him that why he goes to the club when he is a joke among all there. She says people call him Pompey Ompy Pearson, and still you go there. Then enters Mrs. Fitzgerald, who was actually Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Pearson, actually who was Mrs. Fitzgerald, told her that she was just putting everyone at place and that the things were all right now. Means to say, Pearson, who was at home with Fitzgerald's soul, told her friend that now I have settled your family. Mrs. Pearson, Mrs. Fitzgerald in body, requested to have her body then, and Mrs. Pearson, who was Mrs. Fitzgerald in body, on a condition that Pearson would not go soft on her family again. She told her very clearly that I have settled your family, but please don't again be soft with them. Because if you will behave like that, again they will disturb you, will make you upset. They got into their original bodies and Mrs. Fitzgerald left. The mother and the children and husband smiled at each other, and it was decided that they all will have the dinner together and play a game of rummy. Rummy is a play card game. So, my dear students, this is the play which we have discussed today. I hope you have understood or you will understand the story very clearly. But still, if you face any kind of doubt, you will have any kind of query, then you can text me. Thanks.